The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings, everyone. This is Sal Munoz with All Chicago. So we are at about 50, a little under half of the number of folks that registered. So I will be getting started in about 2 to 3 minutes. Again, as people roll in, I'm going to wait to get started about another 2 to 3 minutes. So we will be getting started shortly. Hi, everyone. This is Sal Munoz, System Implementation Manager with All Chicago. It seems like we've sort of come to a plateau with our attendance right now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, we are going to talk about the new HMIS assessment questions that are going to be appearing, that already are implemented in the system. What we're going to be doing today is sort of taking a little bit of a deep dive to review what the questions are, see what your feedback is, etc. So a bit of housekeeping before we get started. In the handout section, you will find 3 different files. They are each PDFs. The first is a PDF of the slides. The second is a PDF of the universal intake form that we will be linking to in our presentation later today. And then the third is a PDF of the addendum form. So if you already have a couple of intakes completed, or if you already have your intake packet and can't make another commitment to add things in, we have an entirely new form for you to be able to sort of attach that to it. So another thing is that I will not be unmuting anyone. If you do have a question, please go ahead and use the questions function. I will not be checking chat or anything of that sort or unmuting folks, but I will be addressing your questions on a rolling basis. So go ahead and send in your questions. I may get to it live or I may get to it at the end of our presentation today. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we will be going over today. So we're going to start off a little bit with the context of why we needed to add additional questions to our assessments, sort of the need, what work groups these questions originated from, etc. Then we will review the questions themselves. And we have two sets of questions. The first is a set of unsheltered questions, and then we have one question around sexual orientation. I'll then look a little bit into the intake form, show you what it looks like, explain some of the logic to you. Then we'll talk about which clients need to have these questions answered and when. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the data quality process regarding this. So how often, do you have to have it for every single client? When will this be counted in your data quality assessments, etc.? And then we'll end off the day with any questions that come through throughout the entire presentation that I was not able to get to. So let's go ahead and move forward. So what additional questions are we adding? Why are we adding them? Well, we're adding these questions and they're designed to fall into sort of two camps. One purpose is so that we can get a client's unsheltered status. And so these questions that are around that are designed to help us get to what a client's unsheltered status is, it's really there for us to be able to determine what the housing history of that client's typical living situation is. So the main purpose is to get a sense of who is unsheltered in our system by diving deeper into the history of where that client typically sleeps. And then we have a question regarding sexual orientation. So why are we adding these additional unsheltered questions? Well, these housing questions were developed to better assist our continuum in identifying clients that are currently or that have been unsheltered. And so these questions, these set of 6 questions, will allow for a more sophisticated method of tracking living situations that are both current and historical. And these questions were also created mostly because clients who are unsheltered but don't often have high interactions with our system, we cannot necessarily make a good, there has not been a sophisticated way of identifying which clients are unsheltered if they don't interact with the system a lot. So the way that we are currently sort of determining which clients are unsheltered is by which programs they are in. But that's not necessarily the case, right? Sometimes a client may be going into a drop-in center, and we would have, but if that client only interacts with that drop-in center, but the rest of the time they're unsheltered and they refuse to engage in any other services, then that client, with these additional questions, will be able to say that this client that's going to a drop-in center is indeed unsheltered. For the most part, that is not, we are able to construe that, but this would sort of allow us to create that scenario and identify those clients with much more ease and much more sophistication. And it also gives us a better view of our clients' previous housing history. So it really means that we are going to be able to see where they typically sleep, get a little bit more of a sense of their housing journey before they come into your project. And a major reason we are adding these unsheltered questions is because there's going to be several changes to coordinated entry prioritization that will be occurring in mid-April. So this is a major driver for why we are going to be adopting these new set of questions that aim towards getting us a better understanding of the client's unsheltered status. So the new prioritization that will be implemented in April, and mind you, this is no longer a draft. We have taken this to the leadership team and it has been voted on. So this is the new prioritization going forward. We are going to start off with a priority population. Our priority first and foremost is going to be on the length of homelessness. So what we're really looking into is to see which clients have the longest amount of homelessness in our system. And note that we now have several different tiebreakers that would allow us to better sort of, if a client has a similar amount of length of time homeless, we will take a look at those two clients and then see who, of those, preference would go to the folks that are unsheltered. And if both are unsheltered, then preference would go to the folks that are that the person that is a veteran. And if both are unsheltered and they're veterans, then we look at their VI score. So that's sort of how the tiebreaker will be working. And so the biggest pieces of priority and the biggest population that we're targeting are going to be folks that have been on the streets for the longest time and those that have been unsheltered. And as you can see, because we have such a newfound emphasis on clients that are unsheltered, we really need solid data to be able to back that up. So we want to get as much data into the system as possible regarding a client's unsheltered status, because that will at this point become the difference between a client getting a match now versus getting a match in a couple of weeks, because they are either sheltered or their information is not entered for that unsheltered status. And so right now, skilled assessors are currently at work to complete a housing timeline of their clients using a tool that's specific to the coordinated entry assessment. So I believe that some folks may have already may have already seen the video that all skilled assessors were required to do, and all those clients that currently have an assessment, we're looking through the highest priority population, or rather the folks that would likely be the most prioritized, the most highly prioritized. We are going through that list of clients and getting this further information so that we have a full timeline and a full data set as to when a client was, to find out when a client was, how long a client was indeed homeless. And then the unsheltered questions are going to serve as a tiebreaker, and this really does affect clients that are currently assessed. So if you have clients that you have assessed and that you work with at an emergency shelter or a drop-in center or at a outreach project, I would really recommend that you take time to work through your clients and get this unsheltered, answer these unsheltered questions, or rather answer these housing living situation questions, so that all clients have the full data set that they need in order to be listed on the one list with their full set of information. And we also have a sexual orientation question that we're going to be adding. This question was developed by the youth work group, and they made the recommendation to include this question. So it really will allow our system to make better determinations regarding the demographics of people entering or at risk of homelessness. Now, I will say that this question, the sexual orientation question, is primarily applied to clients that are youth. So those that are 18 to 24, we really would push agencies that serve youth 18 to 24 to answer this question for every single one of their clients. But for the rest of the population, whether it be families, singles, whatever it may be, we will still list this question out there, but depending on your relationship with your client, it's not as necessary if you serve a population that is not in the age range of 18 to 24. So again, this sexual orientation question, it was developed by the youth work group, made the recommendation to add it to all assessments. We added it to all assessments, but as it currently stands, we are really making a push for this question to be answered by for any youth clients. And if you're able to sort of train your staff and develop a rapport with the client that you're currently working with, then we would encourage agencies to answer this question. So let's look at the rollout. We have already made the questions live on all entry assessments. So whenever you are entering a client as of yesterday, you will see an additional 7 questions on the assessment, where typically you would just see a couple of questions for housing, and that's about it. And we'll go over what the new assessment actually looks like. But outside of that, we also rolled out additional documentation. So we have an article on reviewing what is involved with the questions, and we also have a new universal intake form with an addendum that is on our help desk as well. And we are also in the process of updating our training materials. So before I get into the review of the questions, I'm going to take a look at one question that came in. All right. So actually, the question this person asked is directly related to what we're going to talk about. So let's take a look at the review of the question. So we're going to look into each question. And before we get started with this section, I want to ask folks, what qualifies as being unsheltered? So I'm going to open up a poll. And the question will be, which living situation below would be considered unsheltered? So you should all see a poll that is now popped up on your screen. Go ahead and answer. You can select multiple options, but please answer. I'm going to give it about a minute for everyone to vote. So which one of these is considered unsheltered? Mind you, not homeless, unsheltered. All right, about another 10 seconds to get everyone in there. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll and we'll take a look at the results. So you could see that the 3 correct answers in this poll were actually, let me pull it up. So the 3 correct scenarios is if a client was staying in an abandoned storefront, if they were staying in a car, and if they were sleeping on the train. Though each of those are not meant as a place for human habitation. Now, those folks that answered staying in an emergency shelter, that counts as literal homelessness, but that does not count as being unsheltered. And those that answered staying in the finished basement of their friend, that would actually not even count as being homeless because that's sort of a doubled up situation. And right now, we do not recognize doubled up households as being literally homeless. So if they're staying in a finished basement of their friend, then that is not considered a homeless situation and definitely not considered being unsheltered. And so you may be asking, then what about staying in the abandoned storefront? That's a place that, that's a shelter of sort. Well, they're not meant to be there. They're not meant to stay there. It could be a building that's condemned, whatever it may be. And then staying in a car, cars count as a place not meant for human habitation, and so does sleeping on a train. And I also want to mention that I did say staying in the finished basement of their friend. So finished means that it would likely have, some type of heating, some type of comforts. Now, there are definitely situations where if they're sleeping in the garage of a friend, that comes into more consideration, more careful consideration, particularly thinking about, is it a shed? Is it a place that is literally not meant for human habitation if you're sort of sleeping in a tool shed, something of that sort. So, there's a lot of gray area, but for the most part, just know that if a client is sleeping on a park bench, the street, the CTA, the bus, the train, in their own car, in an abandoned storefront. Those are all places considered not meant for human habitation. So let's look at the definition of literal homelessness. And I'm going to close this poll out. So we have our definition of literal homelessness. So it's people who are living in a place not meant for human habitation, in an emergency shelter, transitional housing, or exiting a situation where they temporarily resided. And really what you want to consider being unsheltered are folks that are in a place not meant for human habitation. So anytime it's a place where a human is not meant to be, that is considered unsheltered. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the questions that we have on deck. So this is a screenshot of what the assessment currently looks like. You'll notice that these questions are the housing history, or well, rather the living situation history of the client. Now we're going to go ahead and break them down piece by piece. So let's move forward. Now, the bulk of these questions are actually sort of conditional. So there are 6 proposed questions that try to get at what the client's typical living situation is, but you'll notice that 4 of them are interrelated to one another. So each of these are in response to the client's current residence or living situation. And as you know, if I go back here, you'll see these are 2 questions that you've always had to answer, and the current residence living situation informs which of these questions you'll have to answer below. So we start off with the question, is this the type of place that you typically sleep? And then its continuation is, if yes, and they selected a place not meant for human habitation, then you'll want to ask where they usually sleep. So what is sort of the trigger for these questions is really if the client indicated they're staying in a place not meant for human habitation, we want to know, what does that mean? Where are you staying if you're in a place not meant for human habitation? So all of these questions are related to those that are informed by clients that have indicated to us that they are staying in a place where they're not meant to be, or where there's no shelter. And then we have 2 additional questions that ask them to briefly describe the place they stay at. And this is more so meant for those clients that may be staying in an encampment. If we ever have to go and find them, they may be staying at the corner of 18th and Cermak. Well, where on 18th and Cermak are you behind a fenced area? Are you, etc.? How can we find you? So that's really what we're trying to get at when we ask question number 2. And then question number 3, again, if the client indicated that they're in a place not meant for human habitation, we want to know if they're staying with a child, so that we can gather data on how many unsheltered children there are out there truly, and to sort of determine what kind of resources we would need to develop to intervene in those situations where a child is unsheltered. So you might have seen in some of the questions, there's a lot of typical, like, is this the type of place you typically sleep? We've asked that in multiple questions here. And again, what does it mean for something to be typical? Well, typically in this sense, it's defined as a client staying at a location indicated for an extended period of time without significant breaks. So a good measure of time, maybe if a client's been staying at a place for 3 weeks or more, right? If they've been hopping from couch to couch or so, that's not a typical place to stay, but that's sort of a typical scenario in which they would stay. But then the most important part is if a client is indeed in a place not meant for human habitation and they typically stay on the CTA, then they would be considered as just that, staying typically on the CTA. So it might be best to actually just do an example, see what you would answer for this next scenario. So we have an example here, and I'm going to open up a poll. So we have Sam, who's been sleeping on the CTA for the past so he's been sleeping on the CTA 5 days out of the week for the past 5 months. On the weekends, his brother lets him sleep over. Where does Sam typically sleep? So I'm going to open up a poll, and I'd like y'all to tell me where Sam typically sleeps. Launching the poll now. So again, to read the prompt for you, Sam has been sleeping on the CTA 5 days out of the week for the past 5 months. On the weekend, his brother lets him sleep over. Where does Sam typically sleep? Let's go ahead and vote, folks. So he's been sleeping on the CTA 5 days out of the week and only 2 days at his brother on the weekend. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with you all. So the majority of people said that they stay on the CTA, and that is 100% right. So Sam typically sleeps on the CTA. Even if it was 4 nights out of the week, Sam would still typically be staying on the CTA. You really just want to sort of get to seeing where a client is staying at for the majority of the week for a set amount of time. So mind you, a 7-day break typically counts as a break in episodes of homelessness. But when we're talking about typical, we don't have to be so exact. If maybe they stayed 6 nights with a relative or something for the holidays, that would not be a typical place. That sort of uh, uh, if someone was staying with their relatives for Christmas for the week, but then they went back to the streets, then them going back to the streets is typically where they stay. So that's something to keep in mind. I know typically has to be defined, but it also sort of it's one of those things where it makes sense, but we want to give you some guidance in terms of what is defined as typical. So I'm going to go ahead and unhide this. So again, Sam will typically be, we would list Sam as typically staying on the CTA. So let's dive into questions 1, 1A, 1B, and 1C. And again, a lot of this is very contingent on what is answered for current resident / living situation. Because as you'll notice, here on my scenario, I listed that my client is staying in a place not meant for human habitation, and that they typically stay in this place not meant for human habitation. And then we get into further details where if yes and selected a situation that falls in a place not meant for human habitation, I indicated that they stay on the CTA for the most part. And because I've already answered these, you'll notice if no and its accompanying question do not need to be answered. So again, I only answered this because my client said, yes, I typically stay here, and that place that they stay at is a place not meant for human habitation. So let's start off with the first question. Is this the type of place that you typically sleep? So essentially, it's just building off of the question directly above it. And for the most part, it's just a yes or no question. That's so the client does have options to say that they refuse or that they don't know, but really what the guidance is would be to ask them, so out of the past month or so, where are you typically sleeping? Where do you sleep the most often? You don't have to get into the minutia of, tracking their breaks, but just ask them the majority of time, where are you staying at? And so then we're building up. So if a client answered yes to the above question, right? If they answered yes to, is this the type of place you typically sleep? Then you'd move forward to this one. And you would only have to answer this question if a client already told you that they're in a place not meant for human habitation. If they told you that they're staying with a brother or staying with family members, or that they have an apartment currently, then that if they say that typically stay there, then that's that. That's it. There's no further questions that you have to answer from this section. You've already done your job. So here we have a client who, uh, so here when a client is indicating that they are staying in a place not meant for human habitation and that they typically stay there, then we want to know, all right, where are you staying? So are you staying at an encampment? Are you staying in a park, the CTA, an emergency room, a police station, the car, a street, an abandoned, uninhabited building, a viaduct, or other? So we're really trying to hone in on what types of uninhabited situation or unsheltered situation our client is actually in. And again, this information really allows us to be able to sort of tweak our different outreach techniques, etc. So it gives us a lot of insight in terms of how we can evolve our outreach strategy. So yeah, there you go. If you have any questions or recommendations, please send them in. But we're moving forward. So if a client indicates no to this question, so if no to, is this the type of place you typically sleep, then you're going to be answering what the client's current residence actually is. So here, if no, where do you typically sleep? The users will select from one of these three scenarios. These three scenarios: a homeless situation, institutional situation, or transitional permanent housing situation. Um, and this, if no, where do you typically sleep, is really asking, like, again, this current residence living situation question is asking where they stayed last night, right? So if where the client stayed last night isn't typically where they sleep, well, where do they typically sleep if the place they were staying at last night isn't it? And then again, this is sort of a sister question to the previous one, and it has the same intention of just finding out, well, what kind of situation, what kind of unsheltered situation are you actually in? So we have a question that came in. This is a great question. So Bob, Bob asked a very long question, but I'm going to try to summarize the gist of it. So for those he's saying, will a client's unsheltered history come into effect even if they've been staying at a shelter for the past couple of months? So let's take a client who maybe for the past 4 years, 3.5 of those years, they've been unsheltered. They've been sleeping on the CTA, but then for the past 6 months, they've been at a shelter. They've been, let's say, at PGM. So in that instance, what we are trying to do, if that client is on the one list, if you remember at the beginning of this, I said that skilled assessors are currently out there, and what they're trying to do is set up a timeline of how long they've been homeless. We will have a skilled assessor go to that client and ask them, all right, tell us from when to when were you in a situation where you were on the CTA sleeping every night, or were you in the situation where you're in the park? So we are trying to find how much of that time that client has actually been unsheltered and homeless. So all that is being factored in. I have not shown you all what the housing history tool looks like, but it is literally creating a start date for their homelessness and an end date, a start date for their housing situation and an end date for their housing situation. So at the end of it, we add everything up in terms of where they've been in the shelter, where they've been unsheltered, etc. So the new tool that we've developed for skilled assessors to tell us a client's housing history, it will factor in the client's previous experience as being unsheltered and homeless. I hope that answers your question, Bob. All right, moving forward, we have question number 2, and this question is relatively simple. It's a open note. You can go ahead and use this question to put in any kind of notes on how to find the client, on when the client is typically at the location they indicated, etc. You could put in addresses, anything. So whatever would be helpful to you to be able to find the client, or if the client is at an intersection but they're behind a fence or behind some place that would make it hard for an outreach team to find them, then you would want to sort of get those details. And so the direct text of the question is, please briefly describe the place you stay. You are welcome to include an address for team members to use to contact you regarding the availability of permanent housing or other shelter resources. And then finally, question number 3, if selected a situation that falls into a place not meant for human habitation, ask if they have children. And again, it's simple. It's a yes or no. We don't include client does not know or client refused. So our hope is that the majority of people will select no, but we want to know when there are instances of children who are unsheltered. All right, so I got another question in from Jessica. Yeah, Jessica, that's it. So Jessica's asking, for that note section, if a client is in your shelter, if a client is in your shelter, then you could sort of leave that note section empty for the most part. So I think that note section is really there because if a client has gone back to that area or back to that encampment regularly, we can go ahead and be able to identify them. It's also a place where you can add in notes on a client's phone number or email address, some ways to contact them. So it's not just, where can we find them? Where's an address? It's more so, what are some helpful ways to be able to contact the client? So if you want to put in that right now you don't have to put in that they're currently staying at your shelter, because any agency that's coming through, or when we match your client eventually, then we would let the permanent housing provider know that they're currently staying at your shelter. So to answer your question, if a client comes into your emergency shelter, you do not have to put in the notes that they're currently staying at your emergency shelter, because that information is already apparent with your entry, with the client being entered but not exited from your project. So now we have sexual orientation, and once more, we ask if the client has which of these sexual orientations best describes them. Again, it's really on client self-report. You would never make an assumption for a client. And also, it's important to sort of gauge the comfort of a client, because this may be re-triggering for certain folks, particularly if you're, particularly given any type of delivery on how you're asking this question. It could potentially cause some tension, or it may be surprising to the client. So just know, as a caseworker and you building the rapport with that client, you would know best when to approach certain clients with this question versus others. But again, this question is really there for youth to help us keep better demographics and sort of notice the trends for youth that are entering the homelessness sector or homelessness services. All right, so Eve is asking why. Do they need the sexual orientation of the client? So we don't need it. We don't need any of that. It's out there open for the community to answer. So this is effective mostly for youth programming, developing resources and approaches for youth. So that's really where these questions are being gathered from. So that's where it's more so coming from, and we're making it available for the general community as a whole if you have the comfort of being able to do that, but it is not a required question as of yet. So we also have an updated intake form for you all to be able to use. This form on the link here, it is available in both PDF and Word. So if you want to use this form to sort of build off into your own intake form, something of that sort, you can do some editing with it in Word to be able to sort of have something to work off of instead of having to build up an intake form entirely by yourself. And let's actually take a look at the form. So this is the addendum. This is what we currently have this addendum there for any agencies that are working, that already have their intake forms completed and may not be able to do another printing of their intake forms until several months down the line. So if you can't do that, we have this 4-page addendum for you, whatever intake form you currently have, and it looks a little intimidating, but just know that we have these tables in the typical sleeping places table. You'll be prompted when to put in a number from here or a letter, etc. So it really just sort of goes down. You want to follow the arrows here to know which ones you have to actually answer, and it gives you prompts as to, well, are you answering for the current residence, living situation, or the typical sleeping places? And then again, we sort of come back here and you'll notice that these are all the questions that are relating to the housing history. So again, if a client answered that they're in a situation between to the table right up here, it's a place not meant for human habitation, an emergency shelter, a safe haven, or interim housing. If a client listed that, then you would sort of start working down this column. If a client listed that they're in a situation 5 to 10, and if we look at that, foster care, hospital, jail, prison, long-term care facility, psychiatric hospital, substance abuse, if we answer that, then you would stick to this column, and then 11 to 22, etc. And that is the addendum. The universal intake form is the same universal intake form with the addition of the sexual orientation question and the homelessness history sort of done exactly the same way that the addendum is done. All right, so let's get back to our presentation. All right, so which of your clients should you update with this information? So any clients entering your project after April 1st should be, you should be asking these questions to them. And any clients that are currently on your roster, we would ask that you begin to work through them. This is particularly important for those projects that have a client assessed through coordinated entry. Now, I know PSH providers, they may have clients that have been there for 10 plus years, right? So your client may not even know where they would typically sleep before coming into their unit. And so what we ask of PSH providers is that upon exit or annual assessment for those long-term clients that you answer these questions. So really, again, for PSH providers working with a population that stays with them for a long time, you don't have to go through your roster and answer this question for every single one of them. Rather, we ask that you fill it out upon the client's annual assessment or their exit. All right, so Brittany is asking, so if we use the new intake form, we don't need to use the addendum. Brittany, the addendum is on the intake form entirely. So if you want to use the new intake form, that's totally fine. It's the exact same thing. The addendum is really just there. If you printed out hundreds of intake forms and you can't go back and change them, then that addendum is there for you to just sort of be able to staple it to your intake form. It's sort of non-invasive. You don't have to change every single one of your intake questions. So it was just a tool out there for folks to be able to use if they didn't want to recreate their intake form entirely. All right, so then let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the data quality. So in regards to data quality, if we want to measure this for data quality, we actually have to take it through the Data Quality Steering Committee and HMIS committees. So if we are not going to begin evaluating you on these questions will not affect your data quality score, participation, anything of that sort, because if we wanted to begin to measure that, the steering committees would have to approve that. And the steering committees, again, are made up of folks that are from the community that are active members of the service provider community. So if you have more questions about joining those, just let me know. But again, for this upcoming quarter, we are not going to be measuring them, but we do want to ensure that incoming and current clients have these responses recorded. So we may just give you a tab on your data quality report where it's showing which clients are missing this question, etc. But that does not mean that it is being weighed upon you. And we have a couple of resources here. We have we have articles on the unsheltered questions, the sexual orientation question, and the universal intake form. So, just take a look at those, and we will be updating those with the recording of this webinar. And if you have any questions about the implementation of this, feel free to contact HMIS at All Chicago. Or you can also submit a ticket through our help desk. So we are at the end of our presentation. Feel free to go ahead and ask your questions. And I'm going to go and look through the ones that I have missed. So Eve's mentioning an audit. You don't have to redo. I don't know. I'm off the top of my head. I don't know what kind of program you have. So you don't have to do this for your entire current roster. We ask that if capacity is willing, that you do it. If capacity is open, that you do get as much of your current client roster answered with these questions as possible. But what's more important is sort of ensuring that if you know which clients of yours are on the one list, you would want to make sure that they are there. So I have a question. If you're a PSH provider and you ask your client where they typically stayed, so if you remember, there is an option that says client doesn't know or client refuse to answer. You can just select that. If your client does not remember and does indeed genuinely not know, then you can indicate that the client just doesn't know where they stayed at before staying at your PSH project. And then we have Jessica, who's saying, I'm still confused about answering the new housing questions and where do you typically stay if I'm doing an interim update for someone who has been staying at a shelter for the 4 months. So, Jessica, these questions are not on interim updates. That wouldn't make much sense. These are questions that are really there only at entry for the most part. We do have it at exit, and the reason it's at exit is for those projects for PSH who we do want that information collected, because if a client's exiting PSH, they may become homeless once more, and that unsheltered status could potentially lead them to another situation of permanent housing. But for the most part, for updates, we are not going to be, for updates, these questions will not be on there because a client's previous typical staying place doesn't really change, right? So you're not going to be updating this and then updating where they typically stay, because we can assume that if they're enrolled in an emergency shelter, they're typically staying at an emergency shelter. So that's a piece of information that's sort of already inherent to your entry, to their entry into your project. And then Angela is asking, where do you document sexual orientation being transgender? That's a great question, Angela. That's actually the gender question. So we already have that there. If a client is transgender, they would answer that for their gender, not on their sexual orientation. So then Griselda's asking, rental assistance. I don't know which kind of rental assistance project you're on. Are you in the state HP? So for state HP projects, you will not see this question because we're not, it's sort of a different model. So you will not have those questions there if you are a state HP provider. Yeah, so Eve, you can update in the original entry assessment. For the PSH providers, what we're likely going to do is add a section of these questions and just really say only answer them if you haven't already answered them. But you can do it in the entry assessment as well. Yeah. All right, so are there any more questions? I'll be sticking around for another 2 minutes. Otherwise, our webinar has ended. Any questions that come in, feel free to shoot them my way. I'll be sticking around for a little longer. All right, folks, so I'm about to wrap up. Hermes, so you're asking what the one list is. So the one list is a list of clients that are currently homeless in Chicago, and we use the one list to inform. Um, well, that's a big question. So I haven't had to answer that question in a while. So the one list is where a list of all the clients that are currently homeless in the city of Chicago, And as part of this one list, we also try to assess as many of those homeless clients as we possibly can. So you'll hear the one list being sort of interchangeably mentioned with coordinated entry because they're sort of one and the same. It's a running list of clients that are set up to be matched to housing to a permanent housing provider, but they only get on the one list after they do an assessment with a skilled assessor. There's a lot more material for you to be able to find out what the one list is if you check out our help desk, which is linked several times in this presentation. All right, so it seems like that is it. Thank you very much, folks. PSH means a permanent supportive housing provider. That's what PSH stands for. Anyone else? All right, folks, so we're going to go ahead and end this webinar. Thank you all very much for joining me today. This webinar will be uploaded to the article, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you and have a good day.